Hi, I'm Hamish Sewell from Soundtrails, and my work builds on more than 2 decades of creative practices and locative audio, where artists and cultural storytellers have used GPS and mobile devices to connect stories with places in which they belong. Every place carries stories, every story carries memory, and every generation inherits something from those who came before us. Soundtrails gives us a way to listen. Today I'm here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra, and I'm delighted to be talking with Teri Rueb. Teri Rueb is a sound and media artist widely credited with pioneering GPS interactive installations, locative media, starting in 1996-97, well ahead of the smartphone era. Her work and approach to locative audio has been an inspiration for me. It fuses site-specific soundscapes with wireless and location tracking technology. Recurring themes include memory, loss, ecology, and the shifting relationship between body, place, and network technology. She's received major recognition and now works as a professor of critical media practices at the University of Colorado, continuing to produce new locative sound pieces through projects like Wanderers 2021 and Confluences 2025. So, Teri, thank you so much for joining me. Let's start with this question around what does deepening a relationship to place through sound mean to you?
Thank you so much. Hamish, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Hamish.
Hamish. I'm really delighted to be here and to finally meet you in synchronous time. We've crossed paths in different ways, and it's an honor. And I really have admired learning more about your work as well, which brings me back to my time in Australia 26 years ago.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to get to come to a conference in Perth, and it was called Consciousness Reframed, and also travel from Canberra into the interior on a 10-day camping trip. So that was pretty amazing. But I was inspired by Aboriginal songlines, and I know that there are, ways in which that can be understood as a kind of cultural appropriation in the current context. But 20, 30 years ago now, for me, coming into contact with that kind of practice, an oral tradition, right, was my initial kind of immediate instinctive kind of connection with the idea of placing stories in the land itself. And so the first work I did was a memorial work in Banff. It was in the Canadian Rockies near the Burgess Shale fossil beds. And it just struck me as an appropriate way to think about contemporary ways of memorializing, to allow people to frame the land in a light way with a light touch, right? Nothing is installed in the landscape. And people can choose to participate through making a memorial or through listening to those of others. So it was a very open framework for participation. But ultimately, it was a healing practice, I think. In the same way that memorial art and architecture and sound in particular, I think, can be so healing and metaphoric in terms of their presence. The sound is so visceral, so immersive and invisible at the same time. That interconnection between form and meaning in that context was inherently about bringing the land and stories into connection and through a kinetic engagement.
Yeah, interesting you use the word healing. I think Australia's a very interesting place because there's a lot of layers here to the idea of sort of storied connection to the land, and I feel like I've worked at the tip of the iceberg really of that storied connection. But there's that sense that it really goes very deep here in terms of that sort of ancestral, that storied connection to the landscape, and particularly the idea of the voice, I think, and the role that the voice plays with connecting us through to to the land and that relationship through voices, through the embodied experience, where a lot of your work is very more sort of, I guess, installation based or more sort of arts based than the narrative. Would that be correct in saying that?
I would say my work is narrative, but in a kind of montage style. So the land, or you could think of it as the map, right? A map isn't necessarily narrative. All the narratives can be drawn out of a map, but as you look across the land and engage with it through these works, it's really the story that starts building in your own mind through the sequence that you choose in traversing it and the different elements that you encounter, both the recorded sound and the ambient environmental sound and the imagery, right? The place itself, the smells, the sounds, the weather, the people, the social condition, time of day. So that I guess I'm kind of creating, I think of it as sort of creating conditions, maybe almost more sculpturally or architecturally, or a set of variables to be predisposed, but not predicted.
But I guess underlying that, you've got an actual platform that's got to support that. And I'm sensing with a lot of your work, you're building them each time when you're doing a project. And to my mind, there's a trade-off there because you're going to be taking risks. You're going to be discovering how that works. You're going to find bugs on the way. And we get this dilemma because if you're wanting to build this ongoing pattern of relationships with place, then in many ways you have to build a dialogue or a trust with people who are walking that landscape and know how to use that platform. So if every time it's different, if it works, then great. But there's a lot involved in terms of outlay, in terms of technology, in terms of sort of risk. Would you agree with that?
I guess so. I mean, I certainly don't enjoy having to build from scratch every time, but the platforms change and the kind of capabilities that we're aiming for often exceed what's available commercially or through other, independent developers like yourself. So because these works that I'm making are usually, they're very, they're large. The sound archives are often 500 megabytes isn't that big in the grand scheme of things, but for people who are accustomed to apps, that's a lot. And sometimes they push into 750,
Confluence is a 770. I was downloading it yesterday. I was going, my God, look at the size of this thing. It's huge.
Yeah. And that's a limitation, right? For people, obviously not everybody carries a phone with that much capacity. So, and we couldn't stream in that case because it was such a remote location. The reception wasn't consistent enough. So all of these variables are partly why I'm always having to kind of build from scratch, but it's also partly because, just different kinds of functionalities. Oftentimes I'm finding that the software and its functionalities have to have unique functions and relationships to those places as well. And so they're unique because the place is unique. And truly, this is often because I'm working in remote locations or conditions where the reception is really wonky. And so you have to kind of consider what is appropriate and how can I speak or give voice to this place.
So for us, it was how do we build in a range of functions which makes it dynamic and exciting and interesting to use, but at the same time, it's robust enough to survive. Because for us, or for me particularly, the idea of legacy is a big issue here. But before we get to the legacy, I'm really busting to talk to you about Walter J. Ong, because you talked about going to this conference in 2002, and there was this output called Consciousness Reframed. And you compared your work to this idea of primary orality, which is really that on place in your body, the performative side of audio and the way in which we become very receptive to the voice or the spokenness or the sound quality that's around us on location in an oral culture, as opposed to a mediated experience through television or radio or podcasting, which is not directly relational to us. We're not there in that moment. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
Do you still see any resonances there with that idea?
So I haven't read that paper in a long time, but my connection to that early inspiration and approach is, I think, still intrinsic to what I do. I think of it as more of a dance between primary and secondary orality. Obviously, there's no going back to a primary moment. We're a literate culture, but we do have new practices that emerge with media that harken back or revivify certain aspects of oral culture. Mobile media definitely activate some of those place embeddedness kind of consciousness. I think frameworks. It used to be I think we still do. We pick up the phone and kind of we're compelled to ask, where are you? Because we know the phone is not located in a fixed space. So you kind of have to fix the context before you start the conversation, which is very painful. But I personally, I guess when people are brought into place, and these works demand a lot of our audiences, and they select for people who are willing to give themselves over for an hour or two, maybe multiple visits. Who knows what the weather conditions will be or what kind of physical exertion will be required. But I think all of those things are part of what fix experience in memory and in making impressions in us that become multisensory and significant. And so, I think that's a part of our embodied being, no matter what kind of mediation we're engaging. But I do think that given how often we're sitting and receiving information from a stationary screen in a desk and chair kind of scenario, even today, that there's something very important about tapping into that deep, embodied, and very human way of making sense of our complex sensory experience and the unfolding of events that we narratize somehow, even if there is no narrative, we impose it.
Lovely. Yeah, the idea of narrative is something that really strikes me as is such a powerful kind of element, and particularly the human voice, the way in which the human voice carries so much with it, whether it's that day, whether it's the mood they're in, the vernacular, their history, their class, their sense of humor, their timing, the relationship between the person who they're speaking with. And in a place like Australia, particularly in the regional communities where I've worked so much, there's often that sense that they otherwise wouldn't be heard. And the idea of connecting that voice, or this dynamic, this relationship, this sense of rapport to a place, and that their life might somehow be umbilically connected to a place, strikes me as this act of love, of goodwill, of trust, of relationship, not only between the speaker and the producer, the person who's recording this, but also between the speaker and the place and their community and that land, and that idea that that people might get to hear them and that people might walk that site and hear them. That really brings me back to, I guess, that principle of narrative being the way in which we translate this. Narrative's obviously human, it's part of the human condition. We're constantly trying to make meaning of the world around us and where we belong. But narrative, and the voice in particular, in all its performance and all its cadence, is that umbilical connection that we have to place.
Fantastic. I really appreciate that in your work. What I've experienced, and I haven't experienced on location, but they're incredibly beautifully crafted conversations and in situ, and they have that kind of codedness of being in place, embedded, very nuanced ways. I think my work might have a much greater percentage of field recordings and non-discursive material, there's a lot of conversation and trust building with people, but oftentimes we're also, if I'm with my collaborator, for example, thinking of Laured's Son with confluences, or Ernst Carroll with fens, we're spending the time to develop trust relationships with place and people. And oftentimes the material that comes from it is just, let's say, for example, the sound of a farrier, working the horse's hoof. And that's the conversation. It's not really that we're talking about what he's doing. It's we're immersed in that sonic ethnography, if you will. So there is a voice, but the voice is maybe distributed across the human and the non-human, or it's allowed to wander in terms of our attentional space.
You're perhaps asking more of the audience or the listener in that situation to interpret and to sort of make sense of that than perhaps what I would be doing. And that I think by narrativizing it, giving it that sense of a crafted story, it's more digestible, perhaps.
Yeah, experimental film versus, let's say a documentary that we're more conventionally accustomed to versus an experimental documentary, which might have a wandering eye, right? Or the soundtrack might be really radically different than what you're saying.
Yeah, but it strikes me that there's been a whole cohort of artists like yourself who've come from that early period of locative media. And part of that really was about the exploration of this media as a way of experimenting and exploring our connection to landscape, this physical connection we have to landscape. I'm also aware that there's a whole bunch of sort of sound installationists out there. I'm thinking of a woman, for instance, who I interviewed a couple of years ago called Joyce Hinterding. And she works a lot with the idea of sort of celestial sort of vibrations and stuff coming in from out of space. And I really get it. I really like it. I can see, but it seems so apropos big, large galleries and museums where you would have major sort of funding to allow people to be able to walk into that context. And I think while on the one hand, I really appreciate where she's coming from, on the other hand, for like small regional towns, which are literally dying, and these voices and these people who have these really deep ancestral sort of connections to places, there's not the scope to do things like that for me. And so for us, the question of to have their voices to be heard on these places that they have these deep ancestral loving connections to is in itself, in part, the strength of kind of what's going on here.
I agree with you, and I appreciate so much your commitment to that. And I hope I've had moments of legacy in that vein. I'm not as concerned about legacy in terms of being Teri Rueb, the artist, the legacies that I can engender or support, foster coming forward. On the note of Joyce Hinterding, though, I was recently looking more closely at the work of Brian House, who also does a lot of work with radio astronomy and capturing. They're sculptural works, but they're presented also just in CD form and not necessarily always in the gallery museum context, which I really appreciated. Sometimes you're even you're in the field, and he has these what he calls macrophones set up, and you're hearing the indexical sound of the moment as these infrasonic sounds are pouring in from everywhere. We're just not usually able to hear them. So I guess the whole spectrum of different ways of being present to our orality and our aurality, A-U-R-A-L. I align with you in many ways. I feel like this quiet work that doesn't travel as easily, doesn't necessarily, it's the minor gesture, if you will, right? The idea that political actions can happen in the most inconsequential gestures and maybe have even more resonance.
Yeah, because if there's been a lot of focus on soundscapes and Murray Schafer and the whole spectral landscape and the industrial noises. I'm wondering who's really holding up and championing the voice, because at the moment with AI, anything is fodder. Anything is just disposable content. It's just going out there. And to me, the voice and the reverence that's written into the voice as an act of listening, as the idea of attuning ourselves into somebody and attuning ourselves into place. The voice is a very powerful instrument, and that's one of the reasons why this idea of longevity is important to me, particularly the longevity of voices connected to place and the idea of being able to hear those voices on place. So the platform and the robustness of the platform and the ownership of the platform is a big deal, because we all know that technology comes and goes.
Yeah, I think that fundamental experience of embeddedness and again, going back to practices associated with orality are intrinsic to our human being. With regard to the software, I'm making works that are pretty ephemeral at the end of the day, unless there's funding to upgrade the work. And that, the period of time that an initial instance of the software works is much longer. Maybe I can get 3 to 5 years out of it these days, but that's nothing when you think of, a painter has a paint.
Yeah.
So I guess I've never been too invested in durability, but I am aware of the fact that I have had the privilege of encountering some incredible places and people over my career, and that's not just mine to decide what to do with it. But there is some interest at this point for me to find an appropriate way to archive this work and make it more, make it more durable for the future. But I'm always resisting taking the sound out of the site. But I'm also curious, do you think that, I don't know, do you think that corporations just figured out that people actually getting off the sofa and walking for 2 hours is too much to ask?
I don't think a lot of the platforms are that concerned about that. I think basically, just like you've got bus tours or you've got boat tours, you've got audio walks. I think that's probably the most of it. They're just simply getting something that's available and they can commercialize that. I mean, Soundtrails has got to be commercial. We've got to stay afloat. Can't pretend that hasn't been challenging at times. And unless you find some way of having a licensing or some way of capitalizing that, then you're going to go under.
I think it should be our next conversation. We have to, unfortunately, I have to go, but I am just thrilled to open this portal with you. And I think that challenge is something that needs multiple players to contribute to. And I'd be happy to keep wrangling that and thinking about ways that maybe Soundtrails is also something that, I can engage with my students or in future works.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm just going to stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beautiful to talk with you. I'm Hamish Sewell. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share this episode with someone who might see their own community, history or landscape a little differently because of it. And visit soundtrails.com.au to discover more stories and explore the places behind them. Every place has a story. Until next time, keep listening.